or Chapter 7. In the following days, Big Fatty Shan and the others kept a constant eye out on Baizialkan's thatched hut. As for Baizialkan, breaking through to the second level of Ki condensation gave him quite a boost in self-confidence, and he continued to focus on cultivation. Currently, he was in his room, wiping the sweat from his brow. He was buck naked, gritting his teeth against the pain as he tried to maintain the posture of the third image in the bamboo scroll. His key vessel was no longer a flowing stream, but rather a small river. It flowed through his body, and with every rotation, cracking sounds would emanate out from inside of him. His previously rotten body was now thin once again, and in fact, he was even thinner than when he had first arrived in the ovens. However, there seemed to be energy building up in his body as he continued to practice cultivation. The flesh and muscle that covered his skinny frame pulsed with power. In fact, if you listened carefully, you would even be able to hear the sound of his heartbeat going about in his room. More and more spirit pressure was condensing inside of him, filling Baizialkan with a feeling of increasing power. After several more days passed, the pain increased to a point where it was simply too much, and he had to give up. He was left panting, eyes completely bloodshot. He had the strong feeling that he simply could and supposed to continue on this way, although he naturally absorbed the spiritual power of heaven and earth while cultivating. That flow simply could and supposed to keep up with how much power he was wasting. Furthermore, the oven snack arrangement wasn't a regular occurrence, and only happened on lucky occasions. Most other people cultivated the violet key cauldron control art by practicing it once every few days. Even people who were more devoted would only practice it once per day. In contrast, Baizialkan had been practicing non-stop. It was no small wonder that Big Fatty Shan and the others were shocked. In fact, many inner sect disciples would have been astonished to hear about what he was doing. However, having reached this level of cultivation, still left Baizialkan feeling insecure and uneasy. After all, he was the type of person who would rather be safe than sorry. Finally, he pulled out the grain of spirit rice that he had enhanced and looked at it for a long moment before using an ordinary wok to cook it up. After the spiritual energy began to waft out of it, he quickly gobbled it down. As soon as the spirit rice entered his mouth, it turned into a thick blast of spiritual energy that was exponentially more powerful than ordinary spirit rice. In fact, the two types couldn't even be considered to be on the same level. As the rumbling sounds echoed out inside of him, he began to practice cultivation. He instantly assumed the posture in the third illustration, and at the same time began to regulate his breathing. Half a month later, deep in the night, a tremor ran through Baizialkan, and he opened his eyes. He suddenly realized that at some indeterminable point, he had actually broken through from the second level of Ki condensation to the third level. This development caused him to go wild with joy. Excitement filled his eyes, and he began to laugh uproariously. Examining himself, he realized that the key vessel inside of him had thoroughly transformed into a small river. The small river circulated through his body at high speed, moving far, far faster than it had before. In fact, he could even send the spiritual energy around to different parts of his body, all with a simple thought. The third level of key condensation, that spirit enhancement, was incredible. He rose to his feet, licking his lips at the thought of producing another spirit-enhanced grain of spirit rice. However, it was at this point that he remembered something the bamboo scroll had mentioned about the growth of internal meridians. Right now, he needed to let his body adapt to the expanded meridians, and temporarily couldn't continue to practice cultivation. Putting his idea about the spirit rice on the back burner, he walked out of his room, although while looking extremely proud of himself. However, almost as soon as he set foot out the door, he caught sight of the little path outside of the ovens, and the tree with the hole in it. Although it was late at night, the tree was clearly visible in the moonlight. This won't do, the case wooden sword is obviously beyond ordinary, even being in the third level of key condensation 1 and opposed to guaranteeing my safety. Frowning, he stood there in thought for a moment before taking out his own multicolored wooden sword. Then he looked back at the walk inside his room. I think I'll feel a bit more confident if I do a second spirit enhancement, he thought without any further hesitation. He retrieved some of the oven's spirit wood. After getting fully prepared, he stood in front of his mysterious wok and kindled the fire. Once the design on the wok lit up, he tossed the wooden sword inside. However, after waiting for quite some time, there didn't seem to be any reaction. Isaac frowned and looked at the design on the turtle wok, then glanced down and realized that the fire had already burned out. Nothing but ash remained of the wood. Muttering to himself, he went out to find some more spirit wood. However, after burning several more batches, he didn't see any difference in the wooden sword. These pieces of firewood are all for one-colored flames, he thought. Maybe that's just not hot enough. Maybe I need the heat of a two-colored flame. He left his room again and found a piece of violet-colored firewood, which was relatively rare in the ovens. In fact, after searching for a while, he could only find a single piece. After kindling it, the flame appeared, a two-colored flame. That was far hotter than a one-colored flame. Almost as soon as the two-colored flame touched the surface of the turtle wok, the second design began to shine brightly. As for the flame itself, it rapidly began to fade away. Apparently the power of the flame was being sucked away. Soon, the two-colored flame had burned out, leaving behind nothing but ash. However, the turtle wok's second design was now shining brightly. It worked, he thought, eyes shining. He quickly put the wooden sword back inside, whereupon silver light began to shimmer. This time, it lasted for several breaths of time, longer than the first time he had done the spirit enhancement. The light began to dim, but then it suddenly flared up and shot directly toward Isaac. This sudden change occurred so quickly that he couldn't even react. His vision swam with light as an indescribably cold sensation washed through him. It almost felt as if he were being frozen over. There was nothing he could do to stop it from happening. It felt as if the coldness was viciously grabbing at his insides. His face went pale, and his vision blurred. It was as if something inside of him was being sucked out and merged into the turtle wok. Finally, the silver light faded away, and within the wok the wooden sword appeared, sharper than ever. In fact, it was so sharp that looking at it hurt the eyes. Although it was still painted gaudily, the veins of the wood inside had already changed. If you scraped away the paint, you will find that they seemed to be filled with starlight, as if the sword had been thoroughly and completely transformed. In virtually the same moment as the new wooden sword appeared, thunder crackled in the air above the south bank of the spirit stream sect. It was almost as if the heavens were rumbling in rage, causing shock to rise up in the hearts of countless cultivators in the spirit stream sect. However, almost as soon as the thunder crackled out, it was gone. As the thunder was booming, a second silver design appeared on the wooden sword. After flickering for a moment, the design faded away into the gaudy paint. By the Alkan, however, Coulden, and paused to even look at the sword. He staggered backward, a grim look on his face. After a long moment passed, he recovered his composure, although fear still lingered in his heart. What did it suck out of me, he thought, nervously looking at his reflection in the copper mirror on the wall. After examining himself closely for a moment, he rubbed his eyes, then gaped at his reflection, looking as shocked as a wooden chicken. There in the mirror, he could see that at the very top of his forehead was a white hair. Although his face didn't and opposed to look any different, he Coulden and opposed to shake the feeling that the white hair made him look at least a year older. My lifespan, he murmured, aghast. Just now, my lifespan was reduced. He wanted to cry, but no tears would come. his whole purpose in learning about cultivation was to live forever. Now, instead of reaching the goal of living forever, he had actually lost 1 year of his lifespan, which was a huge blow. Screwed, how could I ever have imagined that I, the Alkan, would be so careful in life, only to end up screwing myself like this. He sat there in a daze for a while before finally chuckling bitterly. After calming himself down, he looked back at the turtle walk, whereupon a strange gleam gradually rose in his eyes. For some reason, after having some of his longevity sucked away, it now felt like there was some sort of connection between him and the walk, as if he could actually control it now. Heart thumping, he extended his hand and pointed a finger at it. The turtle walk immediately flickered, shrank down, and flew toward by the Alkan. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared into the tip of his finger. Eyes wide with shock, by the Alkan leapt to his feet and backed up a few steps. He looked down at his finger, and then back at the empty stove. This he pointed his finger down at the ground, and a black gleam of light flashed, and a clanking sound rang out as the walk appeared once more. After experimenting a few more times, his expression flickered from grim to delighted to mournful. Finally, he sighed. Well, I can suck this thing into my body, but the price I had to pay was 1 year of longevity. How come it still seems like I screwed myself? The next day at noon, the Alkan was trying to figure out a way to get back the longevity which had been sucked away from him. He was in the middle of doing some research when all of a sudden, he looked up. He had just sensed that there were 8 people heading toward the entrance of the ovens. That was something he would never have been able to detect when only in the first level of key condensation. However, now that he was in the 3rd level, he could instantly sense that one of the 8 people was none other than Zubakai. Almost at the same time, Zubakai's voice suddenly rang out, filled with fury and hatred. By the Alkan, you have elder brothers to protect you. But so do I today. The enmity between the two of us is going to end permanently. Previous chapter. Next chapter. 000 or chapter 8. As soon as he realized that Zubakai was coming, the Alkan shot to his feet. Well, he came sooner than expected, he thought, his eyes flickering with hesitation, although he had done everything he could to prepare in the last half-year or so. He still did and oppose to feel ready. As far as he was concerned, the best option would have been to go into the conflict in the 4th level of key condensation. Only then would he have felt safe. Seeing that Zubakai had come with a group of 7 others, the Alkan knew that hiding wasn't an option. Gritting his teeth, he said, "Fine, I'm gonna go for it." Taking a deep breath, he quickly donned 8 leather coats, and then attached his backup walk to his bag. Only then did he nervously open his door and step out. The first thing he saw was Big Fatty Shang and the others out by the front gate, hefting meat cleavers and huge kitchen ladles as they blocked the path of Zubakai and his friends. I was wondering why I heard the crows squawking this morning. Big Fatty, Zhang roared, his voice echoing like thunder as he stood there, tall and mountain-like. As it turns out, a bunch of brats from the supervisor's department decided to come cause a scene here in the ovens. Other people might be scared of the ovens, Big Fatty Shang, but the supervisor's department doesn't give a crap about you. We received a complaint from Junior Brother Zu, and we oppose right here with the authority of the supervisor's department. Do you really dare to resist us? 7 arrogant-looking men clustered around Zubakai, although they wore servant uniforms. Their sleeves were conspicuously embroidered with the character supervisor, indicating that they were from the supervisor's department, and had a status and power beyond ordinary servants. One of the men was a burly fellow who looked as tough as a tiger and as sturdy as a bear. He emanated the spirit pressure of the 3rd level of key condensation, and his eyes glittered coldly as he stared at Big Fatty Shang. Apparently, he did and opposed. He seemed phased at all by Big Fatty Shang and the others. Hogwash, replied Big Fatty Shang, he was trying to kill my junior brother. How do you explain that?" He then laughed coldly as his hand whistled through the air, causing the big black walk on his back to suddenly fly up into the air, looking completely majestic. Burly man's cohorts looked on with flickering expressions, and as for the burly man himself, his eyes widened, then his hand flashed in an incantation gesture, causing a small flag to fly out. Mist poured out of the flag, from within which the roaring of a wild beast could be heard. Even as the figurative swords were being drawn, Zubekai saw Bai Ziaogen stepping out of his thatched hut, and all his previous rancor and hatred erupted inside of him. "Bai Ziaogen," he roared. As soon as the words left Zubekai's mouth, he waved his hand, sending his wooden sword flying out. Looks of shock could be seen on the faces of Big Fatty Shan and the others, just as they were about to leap to stop the wooden sword. The burly man from the supervisor's department laughed coldly and blocked their path. However, it was in that same instant that Bai Ziaogen, eyes bloodshot, roared, "Zubekai, you've pushed things too far. You and I are going to go all out." Bai Ziaogen's heart was pounding. He had never actually been in a fight in his entire life, much less magical combat against another cultivator. He was so nervous that he was shaking. Roaring to build his own courage, he unleashed the power of the third level of ki condensation. Holding nothing back from his cultivation base, he poured all of his spiritual energy into his wooden sword, then waved his finger to send it flying towards Zubekai. As the wooden sword whistled through the air, the two designs hidden by the garish paint flickered slightly. Suddenly, the sword expanded in size and exploded with an oppressive coldness as it bore down on Zubekai. The speed and majesty with which it shot through the air caused Big Fatty Shan, as well as the group from the supervisor's department, to gasp and stare in astonishment as the ferocious aura of the sword filled the area. All hearts were struck with shock, and suddenly, nobody was interested in fighting anymore, and instead stared at the sword. Zubekai hadn't even gotten close to Bai Ziaogen yet and was struck with terror by his energy. From what he could tell, this version of Bai Ziaogen was completely different than the person he had faced several months before. The way he gritted his teeth and looked like he was going all out caused Zubekai's heart to fill with shock. Next, his eyes widened with disbelief as he saw Bai Ziaogen's wooden sword speeding toward him. It was like a stream of white light, bursting with the type of energy that he had only seen during fights between outer sect disciples. He was so flabbergasted that his scalp went numb. A bang rang out as Bai Ziaogen's wooden sword slammed into Zubekai's. Zubekai's wooden sword trembled, completely incapable of standing up to the force of the blow. Starting from the tip, it shattered into pieces in the blink of an eye. It was completely destroyed, transformed into countless shimmering fragments. As for Bai Ziaogen's wooden sword, it didn't and opposed to even pause, continued to shoot through the air towards Zubekai. By this point was scared witless, using all the power he could muster. He dodged out of the way. The wooden sword whistled past him, slicing his shoulder in the process, and then slashing into a nearby tree. A boom rattled out as the tree was chopped completely in half, and then collapsed onto the ground, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Zubekai let out a miserable shriek as blood splashed all over his arm. Face pale, he immediately fell back. Luckily for him, Bai Ziaogen wasn't and opposed to very adept at controlling physical objects. Otherwise, that sword would definitely have killed him. Third level of ki condensation. Impossible. This is impossible. Zubekai looked at Bai Ziaogen, and he seemed as terrified as if he had just caught sight of a ghost. To be able to unleash such power in a wooden sword clearly required the third level of ki condensation, and he simply could not imagine how Bai Ziaogen could have made such an astonishing transformation in only a few months. Things were playing out in exactly the opposite as he had imagined they would, which was impossible for him to accept. It was like he was in a living nightmare. He wasn't the only shocked one. The burly man from the supervisor's department and all of his friends all gasped and looked over at the Alkan with serious expressions. Forming sharpness with spiritual energy, and unleashing sword light that's only possible by cultivating the violet cauldron control art into the lightness in heaviness realm. There is no other way to unleash a divine ability like that. The burly man from the supervisor's department gasped, and fear could now be seen in his eyes as he looked at Alkan. His fellows had the exact same reaction, and there was almost no need to even mention Big Fatty Shan, and the others were also completely shocked, although they had sensed that Alkan had reached the third level of ki condensation. The fact that he could cause sword light to emanate out from the wooden sword, and also make it grow larger, showed that he really had reached the lightness in heaviness realm, something they had been completely unaware of before. Even Alkan was a bit shaken by what had just happened with the wooden sword. He stared at the toppled tree, then at the ashen-faced Zubukai, and suddenly threw his head back and laughed. So, Zubukai, it turns out you are the weak one. Eat my sword. Delighted that he was clearly stronger than Zubukai, Alkan immediately began chasing Zubukai, laughing the entire time. Alkan's gaze caused Zubukai to tremble, and the sight of him rushing over, laughing uproariously, was completely terrifying. Zubukai immediately scrambled to flee. However, he could only take a few steps before Alkan was upon him. As he closed in, Alkan couldn't help but think of how Zubukai had chased him relentlessly, forcing him to spend so many bitter days practicing cultivation. That bitterness turned into power, which he now used to kick viciously at Zubukai. Let's see you try to kill me again, he yelled, punching Zubukai in the eye. Zubukai let out a miserable shriek and fell to the ground. He wanted to fight back, but his cultivation base was only at the second level of ki condensation, leaving him powerless to do anything to Alkan. You provoked the young master, so now he's going to show you that he and pose as not to be trifled with. Fuming with rage, Alkan continued to kick and punch Zubukai, who was now wailing in anguish. Cracking sounds could be heard that caused both the burly man and the others from the supervisor's department, as well as Big Fatty Shan and the others, to all stare in shock. They watched Zubukai being beaten, and Alkan excitedly doing the beating, and their hearts prickled with fear. Tears streamed down Zubukai and Oposa's face, and his heart overflowed with grief. He still couldn't believe that Alkan had experienced such a drastic transformation in just a few short months. Even more unbelievable was that he could use the divine ability of lightness in heaviness. That was something that was impossible to achieve without years of work and significant skill. In his mind, Alkan obviously must have someone powerful helping him. Furthermore, he was surely more powerful than he had let on before. However, because of his despicable and shameless personality, he had pretended to be weak. Most outrageous was that Zubukai had completely fallen for the act. At that point, Zubukai was overwhelmed with sorrow and simply passed out. Seeing that Zubukai had fallen unconscious, Alkan patted the dust off of his clothes, and then waved his hand, causing his wooden sword to fly over into his sleeve. Then, looking every bit the lonely hero, he did his best to hide the excitement in his eyes. The burly man from the supervisor's department looked deeply at him, his expression conflicted. Finally, he clasped hands and bowed. Junior brother boy, you did a good job of concealing your true strength, he said, his face expressionless. You've earned our admiration. Then, he turned and left with his fellows, picking up the unconscious Zubukai and taking him along too. After they left, Big Fatty Shan and the others clustered around Alkan, smiling broadly. After all, people from the supervisor's department were outsiders, and they knew that Alkan had worked hard over the past months. Therefore they were pleased with the overall outcome. Nice work, kid, you didn't. And supposed to kill yourself for half a year, or nothing. Big fatty. Jan patted Bicey Alkin's shoulder. That's right. I worked so hard that I scared even myself. Bicey Alkin lifted his chin, as proudly as a cocky rooster, as if daring Big Fatty Jan and the others to ever laugh at him again. Previous chapter. Next chapter. 000 or chapter 9. According to an ancient saying, time flying by is like catching a glimpse of a white coat flashing past a chink in a wall. That is exactly what happened for Bicey Alkin. A month later, cold winds blew down the Havenspan River, and through the spirit stream sect. All of a sudden, Bicey Alkin realized that he had been in the sect for a year already. The past year had been chock full of one event after another. He had left the world of mortals to become a cultivator, elevated his cultivation base to the third level of key condensation, and had resolved all the conflicts that cropped up due to him joining the ovens. Zhu Kai never showed up at the ovens again, and when Bicey Alkin left on supply runs and saw him from a distance, he would scurry away, clearly terrified. Despite all of that, however, after a month went by, Bicey Alkin looked as anxious as ever and was sighing constantly. He didn't and supposed to talk to Big Fatty Zhang and the others about his concerns. He simply wallowed in his helplessness. 1 year of longevity, he thought, looking at a tree off in the distance, whose leaves had already begun to turn yellow and fall to the ground. I suppose I'm just like that tree. And those falling leaves are just like my one lost year of longevity. Having reached this point in his train of thought, Bicey Alkin suddenly felt very sentimental. During the course of the past month, he had come up with countless ideas on how to restore the lost longevity. And yet, that white hair on his head remained as white as ever. He made some roundabout inquiries of Big Fatty Shan, and learned that in the cultivation world, methods did indeed exist, which could restore longevity. However, such methods were either well-kept secrets, or as easy to track down as a phoenix feather, or a killing horn. Soon, he even lost interest in eating and drinking, and his face became wan and pallid. Eventually, he decided that he had no choice but to give up and accept the fact that he had lost the longevity. However, the following day, when he went out on an oven supply run, he happened to catch sight of an enormous stone still below the third peak, and all of a sudden, he started to pant. On the south bank of the Spirit Stream sect, all of the mountain peaks had stones less like this one. It was covered with dense script, lines and lines of writing that glittered with bright light. Occasionally, the lines of script would flow like water as old characters were replaced by new ones. That stone still was where missions were handed out by the Spirit Stream sect. Anyone in the sect who wanted to could accomplish the missions to earn the spirit stones necessary for cultivation, as well as merit points. The merit points could be used to pay admission fees to scripture sermons or the magical arts pavilion. They could also be used to gain access to all sorts of special places in the sect set aside for certain aspects of cultivation. Virtually everything in the sect could be acquired with merit points, and they were actually viewed as more valuable than spirit stones. At the moment, quite a few outer sect disciples were gathered around the third peak's mission still, staring at the missions. When one of them selected a mission to take, they would respectfully notify the middle-aged cultivator sitting cross-legged beneath the steel. There were even some servants mingling with the outer sect disciples. The servants wore their uniforms, and the outer sect disciples wore green robes embroidered with cloud and river designs, making it very easy to tell who was who. There were certain missions that only inner sect disciples could accept, but missions like that wouldn't show up on this particular stone stele. The missions here could be accepted by outer sect disciples and servants alike. Many ambitious servants viewed this place as their first step in becoming like that fish which leapt over the dragon gate, achieving a meteoric rise. Baisi Alkan stood there for the time it takes an incense stick to burn, face grim, as he stared at one particular line of script in the middle of the stone stele. Eventually, a look of hesitation appeared in his eyes. Age, prolonging longevity, enhancing pill, and quote, he murmured, and quote, I never imagined that this stone stele would offer a medicinal pill like that as a reward from the name alone. You can tell that the pill probably increases longevity, and quote, after a bit of thought he approached the middle-aged cultivator. When the outer sect disciples sensed Baisi Alkan approaching, they completely ignored him, considering their status. They didn't care at all about servants, who they viewed as beneath them. Baisi Alkan waited until the crowd around the middle-aged cultivator thinned a bit. Then, looking as charming and innocent as possible, clasped hands and bowed in greeting. Good afternoon, elder brother, he said. The middle-aged cultivator looked Baisi Alkan up and down, then nodded slightly. The problem of his own longevity swirled in Baisi Alkan's mind, as he asked, elder brother, one of the missions is to go search for some medicinal plants. The reward is an age-prolonging longevity-enhancing pill. Might I ask whether or not that pill is useful for extending longevity? Age-prolonging longevity-enhancing pill, yeah. It's this mission right here. That pill really can prolong your age and enhance your longevity. In fact, it adds a whole year. However, it has a lot of limitations. It can only be used if you're at the 5th level of ki condensation or lower, and can only be consumed once. If you take the pill more than one time, it simply won't do anything. You could say that it and oppose as valuable. But unfortunately, 1 year of longevity doesn't, and oppose, to really count for much, seeing how charming and innocent Baisi Alkan looked. The middle-aged cultivator decided to add a bit more information. Generally speaking, this is a pill that disciples will give to their mortal family members who are reaching the ends of their lives. However, it and oppose as still very expensive. Do you want to accept the mission? Baisi Alkan looked back at the stone stele, did some calculations, and then nodded. The middle-aged cultivator waved his finger at the stone stele, and the mission turned gray. At the same time, he produced a jade slip, which he handed over to Baisi Alkan. Green spirit leaf, earth dragon fruit, and stone beetle husk, the man said coolly. Collect the proper amounts of those 3 medicinal ingredients, and you can exchange them for an age-prolonging longevity-enhancing pill. After that, he paid no further heed to Baisi Alkan, and instead turned and began to explain other missions to the nearby outer sect disciples. Baisi Alkan left, clutching the jade slip in his hands, the term age-prolonging longevity-enhancing pill echoing about in his mind. His eyes began to glow with decisiveness. I, Nepals, am definitely going to get that medicinal pill and make up for the 1 year of longevity I lost. Bursting with determination, he hurried to the 4C's room, where he pored over the information available to servants. He soon found an introduction to green spirit leaf, a type of medicinal plant that only grew in habitats occupied by hope-cerid birds. Hope-cerid birds lived in large colonies and usually grew to the 2nd level of ki condensation, making the green spirit leaf difficult to harvest. As a result, it tended to be expensive. Unfortunately, there was no record in the 4C's room of the earth dragon fruit or the stone beetle husk. Baisi Alkan patted his bag, smiled bitterly, and left. After returning to the ovens, he asked Big Fatty Zhang and the others about them. Nobody had ever heard of earth dragon fruit, but Third Fatty He knew about stone beetle husk. Apparently, it was nothing more than the molted exoskeleton of a type of spirit bug called a stone beetle. Supposedly, those exoskeletons were extremely tough and heavy, but were uncommon on the South Shore. However, they were common on the North Shore, a result of the fact that most of the techniques they cultivated there were shamanic magics. Unfortunately, despite the fact that both the North and South Shores were part of the Spirit Stream sect, they were separated by the main mountain bridge. Furthermore, only inner sect disciples qualified to be able to cross that mountain bridge to get from one shore to the other. What are you asking about these medicinal ingredients for, Big Fatty? Shan asked, patting his stomach. You can't eat them, you know. Besides, if you try to buy them at the South Bank market, the prices are ridiculously high. When Baisialkan heard the word market mentioned, his eyes suddenly lit up. After offering a quick explanation, he hurried down the mountain. In the year he had been a part of the ovens, he had only been out of the sect on a few occasions, and yet was very familiar with the market outside of the sect. Most of the stalls were run by various cultivated plants-related sect disciples. There were even some establishments that were owned by disciples and catered specifically to other disciples. Gradually, a set of unspoken rules had come to be established, everyone abided by. Generally speaking, any supplies that the ovens needed could be found here. Baisialkan strolled around the market for a while and visited several medicinal plant shops. By the time he got back to the ovens, his brow was furrowed and he was heaving sighs left and right. What a rip-off, especially the earth dragon fruit. All it is a kind of fruit that grows underground. Why is it so expensive? Baisialkan was dismayed to discover that, given his current situation, he was essentially incapable of getting the age-prolonging longevity-enhancing pill. He basically had no concept of money. To him, no amount of wealth could compare to longevity. Unfortunately, he was currently embarrassingly short on funds. Furthermore, he knew that although his elder brothers possessed extremely ample bellies, their bags were as empty as his. They definitely weren't any richer than he was. Although nobody would go to the trouble of calling them to task for eating a bit of the food from the oven's supplies, if they tried to sell that food, the supervisor's department would definitely catch on and would not be happy. After thinking about the matter from numerous angles, Baisialkan couldn't come up with any ideas for how to make some money, other than to sell some spirit-enhanced items. However, that didn't oppose to quite seem like the appropriate thing to do. He continued to ponder the matter for a few more days. On one particular morning, he was sitting cross-legged in his hut practicing cultivation, when he heard the sound of bells echoing out through the sect. The sound wasn't very loud and quickly faded away. Baisialkan slowly opened his eyes. He wasn't surprised by the tolling of the bells. In fact, they rang out every month. He had learned from Big Fatty Shan that the bells indicated that a trial by fire was beginning for servants. Whoever succeeded would be given a spot as an outer sect disciple. For those extremely ambitious servants who wanted to become outer sect disciples, the first step to becoming the fish who leapt over the dragon gate was to reach the third level of key condensation. Then they could select one of the trials by fire. The trials by fire were nothing more than a path of stone steps that led to the top of the mountain peak. However, that path was imbued with magical power, making each step extremely arduous. Anyone who managed to make it to the top would be qualified to become an outer sect disciple. Unfortunately, spots in the outer sect were limited, so only the first 3 competitors to the top, the best of the best, would be able to get in. After all, there were many servants in the Spirit Stream sect. There were thousands and thousands on the South Bank alone. Therefore, there were always fierce struggles to succeed. Of course, the members of the ovens would rather die of starvation in the ovens than try to climb the ladder in the outer sect. Therefore, on this particular day, every month, they turned their noses up at all the hustle and bustle. Baisialkan closed his eyes. However, a moment later, they snapped open, and a strange expression could be seen therein. Then, they began to glitter with excitement as a new idea formed in his head. He shot to his feet and began to pace back and forth inside his hut. After considering this idea for quite some time, a delighted expression appeared on his face. "This is the ticket," he exclaimed. Then he pushed his door open and cried out to Big Fatty Shan and the others, who were currently debating about which unlucky servant would be promoted to be an outer sect disciple. "Elder brothers, I in the pulse, we figured out how to get rich, but I need your help." Then, we can all get rich together. He licked his lips and looked at Big Fatty, Jan and the others, eyes gleaming. Big Fatty Jan was familiar with this expression. It was the same look Buzzy Elkin had on his face when he brought up the idea of making the bottoms of the bowls thicker, considering how much that idea had benefited the ovens. Big Fatty Jan COULDN, and opposed to wait to hear Buzzy Elkin's idea. Ninth Fatty, what and oppose as your plan to tell you the truth, we're all completely destitute, and it's all the fault of that damn supervisors department. If it weren't and opposed to for them, we could sell some of our stuff and get totally rich. Big Fatty Jan clapped Buzzy Elkin on the shoulder, eyes shining with anticipation. Previous chapter. Next chapter. 000 or chapter 10. Buzzy Elkin looked around at his elder brothers, who were staring at him with eyes that glittered like spirit stones. Big Fatty Jan's eyes looked like they were about to erupt with flames. Buzzy Elkin cleared his throat, feeling more than a little bit proud of himself. Elder brother, check this out. The 3 mountain peaks of the Spirit Stream sect all have a trial by fire every month, giving us servants a chance to become like the fish that leapt over the dragon gate, right? And quote Buzzy Elkin glanced around at everyone, looking like the picture of charm and innocence. Big Fatty, Jan nodded in response. However, the sect only wants the best of the best, therefore, no matter how many people participate in the trial by fire, only the top 3 disciples per mountain peak get picked. Am I right? He licked his lips, and his eyes were beginning to shine. Big Fatty, Jan listened thoughtfully. A ruminative expression could also be seen on Third Fatty High's face, although everyone else seemed confused. Big Fatty, Jan looked at Buzzy Elkin, and his eyes also began to shine. Do you mean, considering the levels of your cultivation basis, elder brothers and mine, it would be easy to sweep the trials by fire of all 3 mountains? Buzzy Elkin looked around at his elder brothers. All of them had cultivation basis at the 3rd level of key condensation. Big Fatty, Jan and Third Fatty Hay were actually at the peak of the 3rd level, were it not for the fact that they didn and opposed to want to leave the ovens, and this kept their cultivation basis suppressed. They could have broken through to the next level long ago. Therefore, Buzzy Elkin continued, speaking very quickly, all we have to do is get to the peak of the mountains as quickly as possible and hold the top 3 spots. Then, we can sell them to whoever comes along after us. He stopped and looked at Big Fatty Jan and the others. Big Fatty, Jan was trembling. So low down, he said. Then he took a deep breath and slapped his thigh. An unprecedentedly bright glow appeared in his eyes. The method described by Buzzy Elkin wasn't and opposed to very complicated at all, and was in fact quite simple. It was merely a different way of thinking that, after being spoken out loud, was easy to understand. However, before being explained, it was actually the opposite of what everyone would have thought the idea to be. Big Fatty Jan seemed to be in the midst of spiritual enlightenment. It was as if a door had been opened, leading to a brand new type of life. He couldn't hold back from laughing heartily. Third Fatty Hay stamped an excited foot, face flushed from either embarrassment or excitement. This couldn't be any more low down, ha ha ha. As the other fatties understood, they started getting excited, panting. They couldn't help but stare at Buzzy Elkin with more admiration than ever. Great idea, let's do it. Fudge, that bunch of bastards from the supervisor's department have persecuted us into poverty for years now, thankfully. Ninth junior brother is here now. Let's do it, then. They began to excitedly discuss the details of how to carry out such a plan. After they were sure that there was nothing they had overlooked, they decided to try out their scheme in the following month's trials by fire. Big Fatty, Jan slapped his thigh, delight. Tonight is snack night. Excited conversations filled the ovens. The following month was one of extreme enthusiasm. In fact, just to play it safe, everyone took time to practice cultivation, which was a rare occurrence in the end. Everyone was waiting impatiently for the day of the trial by fire to arrive. Finally, it did. The sun shone brightly in the morning sky, beneath the 3 mountain peaks on the south shore of the Spirit Stream sect. An unprecedented scene was playing out there at the entrance to each of the trails leading up the mountains. Shockingly, 3 black walks appeared. A closer look revealed that underneath those black walks were extraordinarily formidable fatties. The sight was truly impressive. These were the 9 members of the Ovens, and this was in fact their first time attending the trials by fire held for servants at the 3 mountain peaks. Just as they had planned, 3 of their number went to each of the 3 mountain peaks. Large groups of servants were hurrying toward the mountain peaks from all directions, cracking their knuckles and looking very excited. Many of these servants had attempted the trials by fire on numerous occasions, only to fail in the end. For others, it was their first time attending. Everyone was both excited and nervous, and hoped that they could be like a galloping divine steed and make a meteoric rise to become an outer sect disciple. As they neared the various mountain peaks, they caught sight of the fatties from the Ovens. The Ovens, what are they doing here? I and oppose we've been a servant for 9 years already, and I and oppose we participated in the trials by fire 30 times. This is the first time I've ever seen anyone from the Ovens here. The other servants were shocked and began to spread word. Soon everyone was talking about the fact that all 3 of the mountains had people from the Ovens waiting there for the trials by fire. This is big. I can't believe the Ovens people all are going to vie for a spot in the outer sect. What's going on? By the Elkin, Big Fatty Shan and Third Fatty Hay were all waiting at the bottom of the 3rd peak when they heard the shocked exclamations of the other servants. They didn't react at all. In fact, their faces were so calm that it almost seemed they were away on astral journeys and were completely oblivious to all of the conversations around them. They were completely and utterly focused on the trial by fire starting line. To them, this was not the path of a trial by fire. Instead, it was a glittering, glowing road to spirit stones. Bai Zialkan looked especially solemn, with his eyes turned up in thought. Soon a figure could be seen floating down from the 3 mountains. The person to land by Zialkan and the others was a middle-aged man, who had the demeanor of a transcendent being. The first thing he noticed, as he alighted next to the starting line, was the mountain of flesh. That was Big Fatty Shan. Then he looked over at Zialkan and Third Fatty Hay. This man was the honor guard in charge of the trial by fire, and currently, his heart was filled with astonishment. Did the sun rise from the west today? He thought. Usually the people from the Ovens would rather die than become outer sect disciples. What and oppose as going on? After blinking a few times to make sure he wasn't seeing things, an expression of encouragement appeared on the man's face. He flicked his sleeve and began to speak, his voice going out in all directions. Let the trial by fire for promotion to the outer sect begin. As soon as the words left his mouth, bells began to toll throughout the sect. At the same time, the starting lines to the trials by fire lit up, indicating that the event had begun. Instantly, Big Fatty Dang shot forward, an expression of extreme focus on his face. He kicked up a huge wind as he ran toward the stone steps leading up the mountain, moving so fast you might think he was being chased by a ravenous beast. Third Fatty Hay also leapt into motion behind Big Fatty Shan, a brutal gleam in his eyes that seemed to indicate that anyone who tried to overtake him on the path was threatening his life. In 3rd place was the Elkin, who leapt onto the path as quickly as a rabbit, thinking about nothing else but the age-prolonging longevity, enhancing pill in the blink of an eye. The 3 of them were dashing madly up the path. All of that happened so quickly that the other servants barely had time to react. Their faces immediately fell and, gritting their teeth, they scrambled onto the path and began to climb toward the peak. Similar scenes played out on the other two mountains, with the fatties from the ovens instantly taking the lead. The third mountain peak was known as Fragrant Cloud Peak, and currently Baizialkan and his companions were flying along the trial by fire path, far ahead of everyone else. However, it didn't and opposed to take long before they felt increasing pressure weighing down on them, forcing them to slow their pace. Baizialkan looked around and realized that 7 or 8 people were closing in behind him. Suddenly, he was filled with a feeling of anxiety. It was as if these people were on the verge of stealing his age-prolonging, longevity-enhancing pill. Taking away my age-prolonging longevity-enhancing pill is the same as taking away my life. He suddenly held his breath, causing his face to turn scarlet. Then he sensed spiritual energy streaming out into his body, which formed into a powerful, surging force. All of a sudden, he charged forward like a wild boar whose tail had just been stepped on. In the blink of an eye, his speed more than doubled, and he had passed Third Fatty Hay and even Big Fatty Zhang. Third Fatty Hay let out a roar, and then used some unknown technique to similarly increase his speed and suddenly pass up Big Fatty Zhang and race closer to Baizialkan. Seeing that he had just been passed by his two companions, Big Fatty Zhang started getting anxious. He took a deep breath and then all of a sudden, his rolls of fat seemed to shrink. It was almost as if he was burning his fat in exchange for a burst of speed. Rumbling sounds could be heard as he closed the distance between himself and Third Fatty Hay. Soon all 3 of them were speeding along rapidly. When the servants behind them saw what was happening, their jaws dropped in shock, looks of despair appeared on their faces. And yet, they weren't willing to give up so easily, and pushed onward with all the strength they could muster. Unfortunately, there was nothing they could do to catch up with Baizialkan and the others. Their tempers having reached the limit, they began to cry out curses. Damn it, are they high on aphrodisiacs or something? How could they be so fast? Soon enough time had passed for an incense stick to burn, and Baizialkan had already reached the top of the mountain. In fact, he could even see 2 other sect disciples standing just beyond the finish line, waiting there to receive the servants. As soon as the 2 other sect disciples caught sight of Baizialkan, they smiled slightly, and one of them said, "Congratulations, Junior BR." However, before he could even finish speaking, his eyes went wide with shock. Baizialkan barreled along a few more paces, but then screeched to a halt a mere step in front of the finish line. He stood there looking at the outer sect disciples, and they looked back at him. Then, he gave them a charming smile, and spun to face the other direction. "Stop!" he roared, throwing his hands up into the air. Instantly, Third Fatty Hay and Big Fatty Zhang whizzed to a stop next to him. The 3 of them stood there looking at each other, breathing heavily. Then, they broke out into laughter. The 2 outer sect disciples exchanged dismayed glances, unsure of what exactly was happening. The fact that these 3 suddenly stopped running at this point seemed to indicate that they were crazy. "Junior brothers," one of the outer sect disciples said cautiously, "the 3 of you are the first to arrive at the finish line. Just step on over, and you will be promoted into the outer sect." And what? "Outer sect disciples," Big Fatty Zhang said, waving his hand dismissively. "Who wants to become outer sect disciples?" He continued to stand there along with Third Fatty Hay, 2 mountains of flesh, who completely blocked the exit gate. Baizialkan sat down in front of them, jaw tilted up as he waited, lofty and proud. The 2 outer sect disciples didn't seem pleased. "Huh, if you don't want to be outer sect disciples, then what are you doing here? Are you people crazy or something?" Big Fatty Zhang, Third Fatty Hay, and Baizialkan pretended not to have heard, and kept their eyes focused further on down the mountain. Soon enough time had passed for an incense stick to burn. Finally, a long-faced servant struggled up the path, gasping and wheezing. When he saw Baizialkan and the others, he immediately sighed. However, his eyes burned with an unyielding light. This was his 9th time participating in the trial by fire, and this was the first time he and the post even come close to winning. But then, along came the people from the ovens. Looking furious, he was just about to turn to leave, when Baizi shot to his feet and yelled, "Elder brother, don't go, come. Come, you know what, I just can't bear to leave the ovens all of a sudden. I don't want to be an outer sect disciple, after all. Maybe I should give my spot up." The long-faced servant stared in shock for a moment, and then his eyes began to shine. Previous chapter. Next chapter. 00 or chapter 11. Hope, that was the word that flashed into the mind of the long-faced young man as soon as he heard Baizi words. But then he glanced at the mountains of meat sitting there behind him, grinning maliciously, and he hesitated. "You." Baizi stepped forward with an utterly charming smile, looking like the type of person who wouldn't harm a fly. He clasped the long-faced servant on the shoulder and said, "Congratulations on becoming an outer sect disciple, elder brother. You are the fish that leapt over the dragon gate. You will soar like a shooting star, your future limitless. However, your junior brother here worked really hard to run all the way to the finish line. Don't you think it would be appropriate to give a little compensation?" The servant and Apollo's face darkened. If he didn't understand by now what was going on, then he didn't deserve to have lived for so many years. He looked at Baizi, and then at Big Fatty Zhang and Third Fatty Hay. Then his expression flickered as he rapidly considered the matter, trying to decide if it was worth it. It didn't take very long before the long-faced young man gritted his teeth and made his decision. If he lost this chance, it might seem like all he was losing was a month of time. However, who knew what other sort of powerful expert would appear during that month? Besides, who was to say whether or not the 3 people from the ovens might not show up again in the next trial by fire? Most important of all was that this young man was dead set on becoming an outer sect disciple, and now hope had been set down right in front of him. Finally, he stamped his foot. "How much compensation do you want?" he asked through gritted teeth. Beaming, Baizi quickly replied, "Not much, not much. Look, I prepared for several months to participate in this trial by fire. How about we agree to 20 spirit stones? That should be enough." When he heard the number mentioned, the long-faced young man's heart trembled. He flicked his sleeve and was just about to refuse when Baizi once again spoke up. "Look, it's not that I and Apollo am being greedy. All 3 of us are together, you see, so you can't just think about me. My eldest brother and 3rd elder brother both starved themselves and lost a lot of weight for the sake of this trial by fire. In that respect, Baizi wasn't, and Apollo, to lying at all. Big Fatty Zhang and Third Fatty Hay had both lost quite a bit of fat on their way up the mountain." The long-faced servant eyed Big Fatty Zhang and Third Fatty Hay, and inwardly began to let loose a torrent of curse words. Then he started to bargain, and ended up agreeing on 16 spirit stones. Heart twinging in pain, he finally tossed a bag over to Baizi. "All right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Wonderful," replied Baizi cheerily. "Okay, elder brother, please wait off to the side for a moment. Once we have 2 more takers, we'll open the way to the exit gate." Baizi tossed spirit stones to Big Fatty Zhang. When the long-faced servant realized that they were going to wait for 2 more people to come, anticipation suddenly welled up in his heart. It was a situation of, if I get screwed, you better not have a smile on your face. By this point, the 2 other sect disciples on the other side of the exit gate realized what was going on, and their eyes were wide with disbelief. What are you people doing?" one of them shouted. "You're actually selling spots in the outer sect. What go?" Big Fatty Zhang was elatedly counting the spirit stones when he heard the outer sect disciples. Looking irritated, he turned to glare at them. "What are you hollering for?" It was tiring reaching this point, And now I don't feel like going any further. Don't tell me we're not allowed to let other fellow disciples continue on past us if they want to give us some compensation for our efforts. What and oppose is so wrong with that, huh? The two outer sect disciples weren't really sure how to respond to such a statement. It was at this point that 7 or 8 flushed faces could be seen hurrying up the path. The sound of their gasping pants rang out almost like thunder. In the leg position was a burly man of about 30 years of age. He was bare-chested and looked very impressive as he strode up to the top of the mountain. Isaac immediately stepped forward, eyes gleaming. You're a bit late, elder brother. However, I suddenly don't want to become an outer sect disciple. Would you like my spot? The burly man stared in shock, then turned back to look at all the other servants coming up the mountain behind him. Then he snorted coldly and said, You think you can extort money from me, you little brat? Beat it! Roaring, the man waved his arm, causing the spirit pressure of the third level of key condensation to surge out. Isaac backed up a pace and shouted, Eldest brother. Almost immediately, a mountain of flesh descended from above. The burly man's face fell as he looked up, then a huge boom rang out as the mountain of flesh smashed into him. The burly man let out a miserable shriek as Big Fatty Zhang proceeded to sit down on top of him. Although he struggled, it was impossible for him to free himself. In fact, if it weren't for the fact that he was so big and strong to begin with, the air would have been squeezed out of his lungs, and he would have fainted. When the 7 or so servants coming up the mountain behind the burly man saw what was happening, their eyes went wide with shock. The two outer sect disciples also gasped. The burly man, stuck under Big Fatty Shan, almost seemed to be deflating, and they couldn't help but feel a bit sorry for him. Eyes darting about, Isaac leaned over and whispered, Eldest brother, we have an audience. Having known Isaac for over a year now, Big Fatty Shan understood exactly what he meant. Glaring down at the burly man, he clenched his massive hands into hammer-like fists and then began to beat him soundly. How dare you try to freeload off of Lord Fatty, with brazen gall. It was really hard to climb all the way up here. We wanted to become outer sect disciples, but just happened to give up at the last minute. Of course we want some compensation. Fudge! I can't believe you refused us after beating him for a bit. Big Fatty Shan then jumped back up into the air and then slammed down onto the man. The burly man was shrieking miserably and could barely breathe. Then Big Fatty Shan prepared to jump up again, and the man suddenly held a bag out in a shaking hand. Face filled with terror, he blurted, Here, take some compensation. Big Fatty Shan immediately helped the burly man to his feet. Face beaming, he took the bag, glanced inside, then helped the man dust off his clothes. Ha ha ha, why didn't you say so earlier, bro? Look, people are already lining up ahead of you. All we need is one more and we'll open the path. The burly man looked both humiliated and enraged, but didn't dare to say anything. He stalked over to stand next to the long-faced servant, feeling incredibly depressed. As for the long-faced servant, he already felt a little better, and couldn't help but feel that he was smarter than this burly fellow. That was incredible, eldest brother, Isaac said, grinning from ear to ear. Then he looked over excitedly at the other servants, who had been following the burly man, but were now standing there looking terrified. Big Fatty Zhang smiled proudly, then walked back to his place by the entrance, where he sat down again to block the way. The two outer sect disciples exchanged dismayed glances. Compared to what had just happened now, the way Isaac and the others had extorted the long-faced servant almost seemed mild and gentle. They're actually robbing people. This is robbery. They were infuriated, but also a little bit jealous, and couldn't help but wish they had come up with a similar idea back when they had been participating in the trial by fire. Most conflicted of all were the 7 servants, who had been following close behind the burly man. as they watched Big Fatty Shan crushing and beating the burly man. Their eyes began to shine with a bright light. Previously, becoming an outer sect disciple had almost seemed like an impossibility, but now they all of a sudden had hope. Looking around excitedly at all the people, Baisi Algan suddenly cried out in a high-pitched voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, there's one spot left. How about this? We'll give it to the highest bidder." Immediately, the crowd of people realized what was happening, and the sound of their panting grew even louder. The looks in their eyes became even stranger, and their hearts filled with all sorts of wild possibilities. Almost immediately, people began crying out bids, making it seem almost like an auction. "You bid 10 spirit stones." 11. "That spot belongs to me." "You bid 15 spirit stones." By the Alkan, Big Fatty Shan, and Third Fatty Hay were instantly elated. When the two outer sect disciples heard what was going on, it was like pouring oil onto a fire. From their perspective, extortion was one thing, and robbery could potentially be overlooked, but to see the situation turning into an auction left their minds spinning. It was so outrageous that waves of shock seemed to batter their hearts to them. The most villainous among the three wasn't Big Fatty Shan, but rather the seemingly charming and innocent Baisi Alkan. Outrageous, shameless, one of them finally gritted his teeth and spun around, eyes bloodshot with either jealousy or fury. He wasn't an upholstery sure which, as he went to report the matter to the honor guard. Baisi Alkan wasn't actually very pleased with the level of bids being called out. His eyes turned up in thought for a moment, and then he cried out, "Ladies and gentlemen, we need to hurry things up, otherwise other servants are going to show up, and then who knows what lengths they'll go to in order to win." In response to his words, the voice of a young woman suddenly called out from further back down the mountain, "I, Huzia, might bid 30 spirit stones. I come from one of the cultivator clans, and have tons of money. Let's see who dares to try to steal my spot." A pretty young girl huffed and puffed her way up the mountain. She had white skin and a slim frame, and looked quite young. When Big Fatty Jan saw the pretty young girl, his eyes went wide. He was just about to say something, but stopped himself and looked over at Baisi Alkan. Almost as soon as Huziamai's words left her mouth, the rest of the servants were thrown into a huge commotion, calling out increasingly high bids. In the end, she named a price that left the horse-faced youth and the burly man trembling in fear. In fact, they even felt like they had just gotten a huge deal. Huziamai strode out from the crowd, her ample chest leading the way. She looked back scornfully at everyone else, then joined the long-faced young man and the burly fellow who called himself Lord Wolf together. They walked up to the final step, and then exited the trial by fire. Behind them, Baisi Alkan, Big Fatty Shan, and Third Fatty Hay clasped hands and bowed deeply. "Congratulations, fellow Taoists. You are the fish who leapt over the dragon gate. You are galloping divine steeds." The long-faced servant and the others stood there at the top of the mountain, somewhat in a daze. Although they were now outer sect disciples, for some reason, it wasn't as joyous of an occasion as they had imagined. Then they heard the words uttered by Baisi Alkan and the others, and the long-faced young man and the burly servant exchanged rueful, bitter glances. Huziamai, on the other hand, seemed extremely excited. Her charming face was even a bit flushed. "I never thought that I, Huziamai, would ever encounter such luck," she thought proudly. Previous chapter. Next chapter.